If we intend to take charge of our future as a people, then we're going to have to clear away some misperceptions that have kept our civilization in chains ever since they were first established. Since we the people never cleared away the wreckage, the self-proclaimed authorities have used this misperception to build an empire upon which their entire authoritarian police state stands. This war on drugs stands today as perhaps the clearest representation of tyranny that rules the states of America. It is this war that has given governments the power to lay waste to all freedoms once enjoyed in this nation. But that war is not a failure of any government to produce results that justify its existence, but rather our failure, as the people, to correct misunderstandings and to set proper precedents for people to improve themselves. We have failed, and for that reason external authorities have claimed the rights to govern over people who are led away from governing themselves. Knowledge is power, and I think it's time for you to arm yourselves accordingly. But since this knowledge that I'm about to present to you has existed for more than one generation, and we have failed to account for it, I bring you here's my evidence. Where's yours? Despite the incredibly long history of man's use of cannabis, almost a century ago sparks a turning point in our history. The saddest part of the original fraud was that it was so effective, and that it still plagues our society today. In my youth, I was taught that cannabis was a terrible substance, and that it was just like all the other substances I was warned about. The DARE program, or Drug Abuse Resistance Education, was designed to indoctrinate me into a culture that largely looked down on drug use of substances that were largely prohibited. They were wrong, and they never mentioned some of the great benefits that are associated with any style of consumption of cannabis. They never mentioned our vast history with cannabis. They put it into a box, and there it has stayed for the large part of the last century. A simple investigation proves that the box that our society places cannabis in is wholly inappropriate and self-destructive. Our current state of mind is incorrect, and it was never substantiated by facts. Efforts have been made historically to vindicate the users of this plant, but despite those efforts, the mass of the public is still terribly misinformed on the subject. This is a result of manipulation on behalf of criminal government and their news media. What's more is that when we wipe away the propaganda stuffed in our face, we find that not only is cannabis not dangerous, but it is, in fact, quite beneficial. This remains true no matter how cannabis is ingested. It is time for the box to be broken. Time for one of nature's greatest gifts to us to emerge from the paradigm that it has been unjustly placed in. And we will find that when our species once again embraces this most fascinating gift, that we can find excellence again. Within cannabis lies our future society. The one plant harnesses an incredible source of our medicine, nourishment, shelter, energy, plastics, clothing, clean soil, and more. More than can be reasonably presented in a single documentary. Though Harry Anslinger is given the most credit for the crime that is cannabis prohibition, Richmond Pearson Hobson played an integral role in the manufacture of lies that would soon envelop the country. His formation of the International Narcotics Education Association in 1923 led to the publication of a pamphlet called Marijuana or Indian Hemp and Its Preparations. The pamphlet makes some exorbitant claims, but nonetheless, it made enough of a stir as to grab the attention of people all over the country. The release of Reefer Madness in 1937 did not help the situation. Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia became aware of the concerns spreading around New York City. He commissioned a panel of experts to study the matter. The LaGuardia Commission report addresses most of the primary concerns at the time, and yet some of them are still persistent today. The study commissioned the aid of no less than 27 doctors, the mayor, departments of police, education and corrections, the psychiatric division of hospitals, the Court of Domestic Relations, the District Attorney's Office, and the Citizens Committee on Crime. To introduce the eager reader to the proceedings, the mayor writes, "As mayor of the city of New York, it is my duty to foresee and to take steps to prevent the development of hazards to the health, safety, and welfare of our citizens. When rumors were recently circulated concerning the smoking of marijuana by large segments of our population, and even by school children, I sought advice from the New York Academy of Medicine, as is my custom when confronted with problems of medical import. On the Academy's recommendation, I appointed a special commission to make a thorough sociological and scientific investigation, and secured funds from 3 foundations with which to finance these studies. The LaGuardia Commission report was divided into 2 sections, the sociological study and the physiological study. But before getting to the meat and potatoes of the actual research, the panel first laid down the precedent for taking such actions. Quoting the exorbitant claims of the pamphlet published by the International Narcotics Education Association, the concerns are laid out along with a short supplementary history of man's use of the plant. 1. Marijuana is a most virile and powerful stimulant, whose physiological effects produce psychic exaltation and derangement of the central nervous system. Sometimes convulsive attacks and acute mania are developed. The narcotic content in marijuana decreases the rate of heartbeat and causes irregularity of the pulse. Death may result from the effect upon the heart. Prolonged use of marijuana frequently develops a delirious rage, which sometimes leads to high crimes such as assault and murder. Marijuana has been called the killer drug. The habitual use of this narcotic poison always causes a very marked mental deterioration and sometimes produces insanity. In addition to these claims, the pamphlet goes on to tell the readers that marijuana use leads to physical wreckage and mental decay. The use of cannabis reportedly destroys the morality of the individual, leading him to an underworld where the user will lie and steal with impunity and is compelled to commit high crimes and misdemeanors, even leading the user to develop a lust to kill unreasonably and without motive. The pamphlet ultimately implicates marijuana in the commission of many cases of assault, rape, robbery, and murder. It is remarkably curious to me how, over the course of the last 8 decades, a people could not overcome such a preposterous misunderstanding of such a plant. But therein lies my first point. The self-proclaimed authorities have taken these claims and applied them to public policy. Even though these claims have been proven incorrect by numerous studies from across the world, the federal government and the media have made little effort to correct the perception in the public's mind. And so people that do not take an interest are likely to remain forever ignorant unless something dramatic changes the public's priorities. The sociological aspects of the LaGuardia report covered topics like, to what extent is marijuana used? How is it obtained in the market? What is the attitude of the smoker towards society and towards the drug? How does marijuana relate to eroticism, crime, and juvenile delinquency? The report finds that pot smokers are social creatures, preferring to partake in the company of others. Smoke spots take on the atmosphere of a very congenial social club. Smokers engage readily in conversations and openly discusses philosophy or other subjects. A boisterous, rowdy atmosphere did not prevail, and on the rare occasions, when there appeared signs of indicative of a belligerent attitude on the part of the smoker, he was ejected or forced to be more tolerant and quiescent. The attitude towards society and towards the use of cannabis on the part of the user is not one of confrontation or arrogance. Quote, they did not express remorse concerning their use of marijuana, nor did they blame this habit as a causative factor in the production of special difficulties in their personal lives. Except for musicians, there appeared to be no attempt at secretiveness on the part of the habitual smoker. The attitude is in marked contrast to that usually taken by those addicted to morphine, cocaine, or heroin. The consensus of marijuana users is that the drug is not harmful, and that infrequent or constant use of marijuana does not result in physical or mental deterioration. Addiction concerns are quite contrary to what is charged. A person may be confirmed smoker for a prolonged period and give up the drug voluntarily without experiencing any craving for it or exhibiting withdrawal symptoms. He may, at some time later on, go back to its use. There are apparently no signs indicative of frustration in the smoker at not being able to gratify the desire for the drug. We consider this point highly significant since it is so contrary to the experience of users of other narcotics. In addition, the user appears to be quite conscious of the quantity he requires to reach the effects called high. Once the desired effect is obtained, he cannot be persuaded to consume more. Marijuana's contribution to the eroticism witnessed in the film Reefer Madness is addressed and invalidated according to the research conducted by the Commission. Quote, visits to brothels, which occasionally also served as tea pads, revealed that the use of marijuana was not linked to sensuality. the team is able to conclude that marijuana is not used for direct sexual stimulation. The role of marijuana in the commission of crimes is studied. The commission finds in a sample of criminal offenders, quote, among those with longer records, that is, from 4 to 7 previous arrests, none showed progression from the use of drugs to other crimes. They also find that in the vast majority of cases in this group of 135, then, the earlier use of marijuana apparently did not predispose to crime, even that of using other drugs. Certainly, one of the biggest concerns regarding society's use of cannabis was the reported prevalence of use among school children. The commission observed how the children were obtaining cannabis, to determine the validity of complaints about it made by parents or police, to interview school officials, and to gather relevant information from city bureaus and private agencies. The findings of the commission clearly demonstrate that, although some use is reported among school children, the practice is not widespread. This commission also finds, according to the children's court records for 1939, that marijuana is not an important factor in the development of delinquency. To conclude the sociological aspects of this report is a list of 13 items given up for consideration. The public might have found them comforting had they paid any attention to it. Conclusions indicate that though used extensively in Manhattan, the problem is not as acute as reported in other parts of the U.S. That the introduction of marijuana was recent to the time period, its purchase price is low, distribution is centered around Harlem. Majority of smokers are black and Latino, that the use of the drug produces a definite feeling of adequacy. Marijuana use does not lead to addiction in the medical sense of the word. Sale and distribution is not under the control of any single organized group. Cannabis use does not lead to morphine, heroin, or cocaine use, or addiction. Pot use is not a major factor in the commission of major crimes. It is not widespread among school children, and that the concern for catastrophic effects of marijuana smoking in the city of New York is unfounded. The physiological research is also quite revealing, but without getting into too much detail, here's what the commission found. That even though, at times, subjects were urged to smoke more, no subject could be persuaded to take any more. People laugh longer and more frequently under the influence of marijuana. Psychomotor functions can exhibit impairment for a specific, non-permanent duration and at a specified time after ingestion. Users have a tendency to talk too much. Number concepts gained in ability more under the influence of cannabis than gains observed when not under the influence of cannabis. Verbal functions are also accelerated. Non-users experience learning accelerations not paralleled in the undrugged state. Reactions that are natively alien to the individual cannot be induced by the ingestion or the smoking of the drug. The LaGuardia Commission report is but one example of professionally researched material on which to base our current understandings of cannabis. And bear in mind that this was published early in the 20th century. It is remarkable to realize that people still fear cannabis use today, and for no more reason than the fictions in their heads. Growing weary of the general ignorance with regard to this substance, NORMAL, or the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws, files petition with the DEA in 1988 to reschedule. In the laws set forth by the Controlled Substances Act, a Schedule I substance has a high potential for abuse, no currently accepted medical use in the United States, and a lack of accepted safety for use and treatment. Schedule II substance is precisely the same, except that the substance actually has accepted medical use. Given that cannabis has been used for medicine, among other things, since recorded medical history began, the question of scheduling is really quite ridiculous. But Judge Young discovers this as we move on. The agency, NORMAL, and other participating organizations agree upon two criteria with which to assess the rescheduling. The first objective is to determine whether the marijuana plant has a currently accepted medical use and treatment in the United States, or a currently accepted medical use with severe restrictions. Second is to determine whether there is a lack of accepted safety for use of the marijuana plant under medical supervision. The review process is begun by analyzing various doctors' reports from around the nation where cannabis has been used with or without success or permission. Three conditions are agreed upon to assess the merits of cannabis use: cancer/chemotherapy, glaucoma, and multiple sclerosis. The petition begins with a review of documented cases where patients found cannabis to be helpful in the relief of their chemotherapy side effects. I will share with you one case that caught my attention. In late 1980, a 3-year-old boy was brought by his parents to a hospital in Spokane, Washington. The child was diagnosed as having cancer. Surgery was performed. Chemotherapy was begun. The child became extremely nauseated and vomited for days after each chemotherapy treatment. He could not eat regularly. He lost strength. He lost weight. His body's ability to ward off common infections, other life-threatening infections, significantly decreased. Chemotherapy's after effects caused the child great suffering. They caused his watching parents great suffering. Several standard available antiemetic agents were tried by the child's doctors. None of them succeeded in controlling his nausea or his vomiting. Learning of the existence of research studies with THC or marijuana, the parents asked the child's doctor to arrange for their son to be the subject of such a study, so that he might have access to marijuana. The doctor refused, citing the volume of paperwork and record-keeping detail required in such programs and his lack of administrative personnel to handle it. The child's mother read an article about marijuana smoking helping chemotherapy patients. She obtained some marijuana from friends. She baked cookies for her child with marijuana in them. She made tea for him with marijuana in it. When the child ate these cookies or drank this tea in connection with his chemotherapy, he did not vomit. His strength returned. He regained lost weight. His spirits revived. The parents told the doctors and nurses at the hospital of their giving marijuana to their child. None objected. They all accepted smoking marijuana as effective in controlling chemotherapy-induced nausea and vomiting. They were interested to see the results of the cookies. Soon this child was riding a tricycle in the hallways of the Spokane hospital shortly after his chemotherapy treatments, while other children there were still vomiting into pans, tied to intravenous bottles in an attempt to rehydrate them, to replace the liquids they were vomiting up. Parents of some of the other patients asked the parents of this lively child how he seemed to tolerate his chemotherapy so well. They told of the marijuana use. Of those parents who began giving marijuana to their children, none ever reported back encountering any adverse side effects. In the vast majority of these cases, the other parents reported significant reduction in their children's vomiting and appetite stimulation as a result of marijuana. The staff, doctors, and nurses at the hospital knew of this passing on of information about marijuana to other parents, and they approved. They never told the first parents to hide their son's medical use of marijuana. They accepted the effectiveness of the cookies and the tea containing it. Here in California, as in Spokane, other parents noticed the striking difference between their children after chemotherapy and the first child. Other parents asked the parents of the first child about it, were told of the use of marijuana, tried it with their children, and saw dramatic improvement. They accepted its effectiveness. In the words of the mother of the first child, when your kid is riding a tricycle while his other hospital buddies are hooked up to IV needles, their heads hung over vomiting buckets, you don't need a federal agency to tell you marijuana is effective. The evidence is in front of you, so stark that it cannot be ignored. Despite the findings of this petition, marijuana is still considered effective in the treatment of glaucoma, but this review finds that it is lacking. In sum, the judge writes, the evidence here tending to show that marijuana is accepted for treatment of glaucoma falls far, far short of the quantum of evidence tending to show that marijuana is accepted for treatment of emesis in cancer patients. The preponderance of the evidence here, identified by petitioners in their briefs, does not establish that a respectable minority of physicians has accepted marijuana for glaucoma treatment. In the final illness review section, the discussion is as follows. Based upon the rationale set out in pages 26 to 34 above, the administrative law judge concludes that within the meaning of the Act 21 U.S.C. 812b2b, marijuana has a currently accepted medical use and treatment in the United States for spasticity resulting from multiple sclerosis and other causes. It would be unreasonable, arbitrary, and capricious to find otherwise. The facts set out above, uncontroverted by the agency, establish beyond question that some doctors in the United States accept marijuana as helpful in such treatment for some patients. The record here shows that they can constitute a significant minority of physicians. Nothing more can be reasonably required. That some doctors would have more studies and test results in hand before accepting marijuana's usefulness here is irrelevant. The same is true with respect to the hyperparathyroidism from which Irvin Rosenfeld suffers. His disease is so rare, and so few physicians appear to be familiar with it, that acceptance by one doctor of marijuana as being useful in treating it ought to satisfy the requirement for a significant minority. The agency points to no evidence of record tending to establish that marijuana is not accepted by doctors in connection with this most unusual ailment. Refusal to acknowledge acceptance by a significant minority, in light of the case history detailed in this record, would be unreasonable, arbitrary, and capricious. And last is the safety review of cannabis under medical supervision. Judge Young writes, "The most obvious concern when dealing with drug safety is the possibility of lethal effects. Can the drug induce death? Nearly all medicines have toxic, potentially lethal effects, but marijuana is not such a substance. There is no record in the extensive medical literature describing a proven, documented cannabis-induced fatality." This is a remarkable statement. First, the record on marijuana encompasses 5,000 years of human experience. Second, marijuana is now used daily by enormous numbers of people throughout the world. Estimates suggest that from 20 million to 50 million Americans routinely, albeit illegally, smoke marijuana without the benefit of direct medical supervision. Yet, despite this long history of use, and the extraordinarily high number of social smokers, there are simply no credible medical reports to suggest that consuming marijuana has caused a single death. By contrast, aspirin, a commonly used over-the-counter medicine, causes hundreds of deaths each year. Drugs used in medicine are routinely given what is called an LD50. The LD50 rating indicates at what dosage 50% of test animals receiving a drug will die as a result of drug-induced toxicity. A number of researchers have attempted to determine marijuana's LD50 rating in test animals without success. Simply stated, researchers have been unable to give animals enough marijuana to induce death. At present, it is estimated that marijuana's LD50 is around 1 to 20,000 or 40,000. In layman's terms, this means that in order to induce death, a marijuana smoker would have to consume 20,000 to 40,000 times as much marijuana as is contained in one marijuana cigarette. NIDA supplied marijuana cigarettes weigh approximately 0.9 grams. A smoker would theoretically have to consume nearly 1,500 pounds of marijuana within about 15 minutes to induce a lethal response. In practical terms, marijuana cannot induce a lethal response as a result of drug-related toxicity. Another method of classifying a drug's safety is by its therapeutic ratio. A commonly used over-the-counter product like aspirin has a therapeutic ratio of around 1 to 20. 2 aspirins are the recommended dose for adult patients. 20 times this dose, or 40 aspirins, may cause a lethal reaction in some, and will almost certainly cause gross injury to the digestive system, including extensive internal bleeding. By contrast, marijuana's therapeutic ratio, like its LD50, is impossible to quantify because it is so high. In strict medical terms, marijuana is far safer than many foods we commonly consume. For example, eating 10 raw potatoes can result in a toxic response. By comparison, it is physically impossible to eat enough marijuana to induce death. Marijuana in its natural form is one of the safest therapeutically active substances known to man. By any measure of rational analysis, marijuana can safely be used within a supervised routine of medical care. After establishing clear and unquestionable conclusions with regard to the safety of cannabis, Young describes the nature of some chemicals, most often employed in chemotherapy, and all have accepted safety for use under medical supervision. He writes, "Some of the drugs most widely used in chemotherapy treatment of cancer have adverse effects as follows." He discusses cisplatin, nitrogen mustard, procarbazine, cytoxin, and adriamycin. Nitrogen mustard in particular is a drug that used in therapy for Hodgkin's disease, nauseates, so toxic to the skin that, if dropped on the skin, this chemical literally eats it away along with other tissues it contacts. If patient's intravenous lead slips during treatment and this drug gets on or under the skin, the patient may suffer serious injury, including temporary and in extreme cases permanent loss of the use of the arm. Further discussion states that while each of these agents has its particular adverse effects, As indicated above, they also cause a number of similar disturbing adverse effects. Most of these drugs cause hair loss. Studies increasingly indicate all of these drugs may cause other forms of cancer. Death due to kidney, heart, or respiratory failure is a very real possibility with all of these agents, and the margin for error is minimal. Similarly, there is a danger of overdosing a patient weakened by his cancer. Put simply, there is very great risk associated with the medical use of these chemical agents. Despite these high risks, all of these drugs are considered safe for use under medical supervision and are regularly administered to patients on doctor's orders in the United States today. And finally, his conclusion and recommended decision. Based upon the foregoing facts and reasoning, the administrative law judge concludes that the provisions of the Act permit and require the transfer of marijuana from Schedule 1 to Schedule 2. The judge realizes that strong emotions are aroused on both sides of any discussion concerning the use of marijuana. Nonetheless, it is essential for this agency and its administrator calmly and dispassionately to review the evidence of record, correctly apply the law, and act accordingly. Marijuana can be harmful. Marijuana is abused. But the same is true of dozens of drugs or substances which are listed in Schedule 2 so that they can be employed in the treatment of by physicians in proper cases despite their abuse potential. Transferring marijuana from Schedule 1 to Schedule 2 will not, of course, make it immediately available in pharmacies throughout the country for legitimate use and treatment. Other government authorities, federal and state, will doubtless have to act before that might occur. But this agency is not charged with responsibility or given authority over the myriad other regulatory decisions that may be required before marijuana can actually be legally available. This agency is charged merely with determining the placement of marijuana pursuant to the provisions of the Act. Under our system of laws, the responsibilities of other regulatory bodies are the concern of those bodies, not of this agency. There are those who, in all sincerity, argue that the transfer of marijuana to Schedule 2 will send a signal that marijuana is okay generally for recreational use. This argument is specious. It presents no valid reason for refraining from taking an action required by law in light of the evidence. If marijuana should be placed in Schedule 2 in obedience to the law, then that is where marijuana should be placed, regardless of its misinterpretation of the placement by some. The reasons for the placement can and should be clearly explained at the time the action is taken. The fear of sending such a signal cannot be permitted to override the legitimate need, amply demonstrated in this record, of countless sufferers for the relief marijuana can provide when prescribed by a physician in a legitimate case. So now what we have is a situation where we know that cannabis is not dangerous, and we have had a small glimpse into the beneficial qualities of the plant. The start of the misinformation campaign began, in earnest, in 1923 with the formation of the International Narcotics Education Association. We know that its claims were entirely false. However, when Harry Anslinger and the Bureau of Narcotics produced the film Reefer Madness, the public is shocked into believing a false portrayal of cannabis yet again. The concern generated over the pamphlet and the film is addressed by a significant host of top authorities in the government of Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia of New York City. They established that no apparent harm comes from the use of the substance. In addition to the LaGuardia Commission report concluding cannabis's harmlessness, the report itself cites a previous study by the Army Board of Inquiry. That report too concludes the relative harmlessness of the drug. These examples, in reality, comprise but only a tiny fraction of the public information available on the subject. I was turned on to the LaGuardia Commission report in the DEA petition from this brief list which includes excerpts. Studies on cannabis predate the 1900s. They all reach similar conclusions. This list too is paled by comparison to the host of available studies on websites such as Grass City Forums. This masterful compilation of research categorized by the illness studied is a tremendous source of investigator research. Unfortunately, most people don't like to read, which is the source of many of our troubles. But even those who prefer video have an abundant collection of works by which to obtain this vital information. But first let us realize that only recently has the mainstream media come out to discuss the issues in light of the public's increasing awareness. Despite the host of conclusive evidence available at our fingertips, we continue to have a portrayal of a debate. This farce distracts us from the most heinous crimes committed in the name of prohibition, but it does not in any way absolve the media of their crimes. The portrayal of debate allows criminal government to continue to justify spending as long as they can on the prison industrial complex and other social control schemes. But adapted as we the people can be, some of us would rather not live without cannabis, whether or not the law is consonant with that pursuit.
Serious emotional side effects as a result of that. So I think the issue here is, being able to decriminalize marijuana, but not making it legal.
But let me ask you this then. Let me ask you this then.
Okay, I think that it's safe. Okay, because it's not.
Right. I think you're slightly softening your position though from when I last spoke to you, because unless I'm wrong, the logical extension of your argument is that we should be banning all sorts of prescription drugs, probably alcohol as well, and tobacco. They should all be banned as well as cannabis, because that's the logical way of looking at your argument.
No, I never, and I'm sorry if you misunderstood me, that all these drugs do have a place. The problem is that we don't have a medical restrictions, that these drugs are all too open on the market for abuse. Okay, marijuana needs to be a controlled substance, not legalized where we have commercials and we're sort of, the corporations are talking about which drug to get loaded on, marijuana this, marijuana that.
Okay,
let me get
to Sanjay.
We have to come up with a different concept.
Okay,
other than legalized or not.
Let me go back to Sanjay. Let me ask you, Sanjay. I've made my stunning confession. I tried a bit of cannabis when I was younger. Have you tried it?
I have tried it.
What effect did it have on you compared to, say, drinking alcohol or whatever?
Well, the irony is, in some ways, because I've been working on this documentary, it was a while ago that I tried this. I didn't particularly care for it, actually. It made me kind of anxious, and it wasn't a very pleasant feeling, I think. And I've talked to a lot of people who've had similar sort of experiences. But from a medicinal standpoint, this idea that it can provide something that isn't already provided, I think the doctor, he's sort of saying you're going to see ads for it, making it sound like it's some over-the-counter drug that everyone can buy. Right now, it's listed as the most dangerous substance. It's in the most dangerous substances in America.
I think.
The addiction is possibly real, about 9%. Put it in context, cocaine is about 20%. That's actually considered less dangerous than marijuana. Alcohol has a higher rate of addiction. Smoking, 30%, and that leads to far more deaths than marijuana. So
The host of videos available to viewers are both informative and well documented. The research of Dr. Donald Taskin at UCLA Medical Center is cited in one particular program, What If Cannabis Cured Cancer? It discusses the benefits to the lungs of even heavy smokers with respect to their future development of lung cancer. I had the pleasure of reading this study when it was released in 2006. The ironic thing about this 50-minute film is that it is produced in the United States and it is narrated in English. It has all the hallmarks of a History Channel episode, and yet, to watch it on YouTube, you can only find it under the title Marijuana Documentary. In addition, you will have to watch it with foreign subtitles. Now ask yourself why you are watching an American-made film that is narrated in English with foreign subtitles. Could we not find an episode that was shown without them? Was this film even aired in the United States? Here's another case for further investigation, but the suppression of information, in my mind, has already been firmly established.
Positive association between marijuana, even heavy marijuana use, which we define as more than 10 joint years. Even if you look at more than 60 joint years, a joint a day, times the number of joints smoked, we could not see an association. So I think it's really essentially a negative study. We failed to find any positive association with cancer.
Is it possible that the tar in smoked pot could be causing malignancies while the chemical constituents in pot are curing them at the same time? Although there's some concern that marijuana can exacerbate schizophrenia and psychosis in a few patients already suffering from these diseases, recent extensive studies in the UK have failed to support a causal relationship between marijuana and mental disorder.
The Union, the business behind getting high, is a 2-hour film that is perhaps the most in-depth discussion of what happened to cannabis and where we are with it today. Any cannabis user armed with the facts laid out bare in this film will be well equipped in most debates on which one might encounter. You might even be giving yourself a chance at the nullification of this criminal law. When We Grow, This Is What We Can Do is a profound film produced by a 15-year-old in the United Kingdom. He too is lost in confusion during the investigation of cannabis policy. The original prohibition began here, but it is spread across the entire globe. But in the confusion, this producer manages to bring to light some less known applications of cannabis, like hempcrete. This form of concrete actually petrifies over time, rather than disintegrating like most concretes used today. This film also documents the life of one woman who is far better off for using cannabis than she had ever been prior to her decision.
Maybe she'll go away.
Yeah.
And I frankly cannot see any reason why people shouldn't smoke cannabis to help them, if it does help them.
Well, you don't have to smoke it. I mean, obviously you can eat it. You can take it transdermally. You can create an ointment or a gel which can be rubbed on the skin. It can be rubbed directly, you know, if it's for muscular pains or something, it can be rubbed directly on the area which hurts or is inflamed. The other technique is vaporizing.
Blows hot air, 190 degrees centigrade, and that just encourages a vapour from the plant. Absolutely no combustion whatsoever. And a little mouthpiece goes on.
What would you do without cannabis?
I wouldn't bother living.
It's ridiculous for a drug which is as pretty harmless as cannabis not to be available for people who have medical need.
It's unjust, it's cruel, it's more than cruel, it's evil, and something's got to be done about it.
All walks of society use cannabis. We don't look like anything or anybody. We look like everyone.
We've done 3 months worth of research for this film, and it's still not clear to us yet why we put ourselves at such a disadvantage, both medically and industrially, in terms of cannabis, just to stop a few people getting high.
In a world at the minute where there is no money, we keep being told, as it were, and we will owe a shitload. Growing a big old farm of green and selling it as a cash crop, with the tax there, that could fucking bail out a lot of people.
So we're in a strange situation where everyone knows that the law is wrong, but no one has the courage to say the law is wrong, let's change it. So you have this sort of ratchet effect with each of the two major parties trying to out-muscle the other on being article because they think that will give them some votes. In practice it probably doesn't, but they've got stuck in that mindset. They cannot think clearly about it.
Cannabis gives me a way to live.
All we need is some clarity. We need some clarity and some truth. And then the benefits of cannabis become self-evident.
Clearing the Smoke, The Science of Cannabis, is yet another masterfully constructed demonstration that policies on cannabis are entirely criminal. This film demonstrates some of the remarkable properties of cannabinoids, the active compounds in cannabis. Like What If Cannabis Cured Cancer, this film includes interviews with doctors and other professionals in the field who also argue against the absurdity of criminal law. It is a full-feature film and is 1 hour long, but these videos are not the only arguments available. Jack Herer spent 18 years in prison for his engagement in the global cannabis trades. During his time, he meticulously researched and developed an argument that cannabis, if used for all its gifts, can save the world. By relieving the scarcity of medicine, food, fuel, fiber, building materials, and more, cannabis can satisfy even the most ardent supporters of anti-global warming propaganda. In 16 short chapters, Herer lays out his argument, and no one has taken the time to research thoroughly and refute his arguments. Personally, I think he's right. But now that we have established that cannabis, despite contrary opinion, is not dangerous, that its use in many, if not all cases, is beneficial in virtually every respect, we must now review where we are today in this struggle. And to the credit of those in law enforcement, some of those who have done their own research have switched sides in pursuit of justice. Barry Cooper, a former narcotics officer with the Texas Law Enforcement Agency, has gone the extra mile in his pursuit. Sadly, he has had to flee the country as a result of backlash from the criminal empire. But there are many others. In conjunction with organizations like LEAP, Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, MPP, or the Marijuana Policy Project, Normal, Drug Policy Alliance, the Cato Institute, and others, we will bring down this tyranny. But waiting for a monolithic bureaucracy to pull its head out of its ass is no solution. So just as people long ago realized, freedom is to be exercised today, one day at a time. What we need to stop doing is supporting this behavior by law enforcement or any other criminal enterprise.
When Harry Anslinger testified before the Senate that marijuana needed to be made illegal because of its effects on the degenerate races, and I'll quote him when he said before the Senate that marijuana causes white women to seek relations with Negroes, and marijuana has been illegal ever since, and the debate is over. It's much safer than alcohol, and the harm we're causing on American citizens by placing them in prison and jail where they can be murdered, stabbed, or raped for such a harmless plant is a greater harm we're causing than if we would have just allowed them to smoke the pot.
All right, and he says just let them smoke the pot.
Well, he's very far off base. I mean, as a former DEA agent on so many levels, I'm disgusted by what he's doing. But the main problem...
I'm disgusted by the DEA's attempts to block my testimony in court regarding drug dogs false alerting by you guys releasing a 2002 highly sensitive and confidential report. You faxed it, and it ultimately wound up in the hands of a civilian, which jeopardized the lives of other civilians.
Let you talk for a minute. Let me talk.
Barry, hold on. Barry, let Ann respond.
My concern is that we are minimizing the problems of marijuana. Marijuana is not a safe drug. Steve, I work with people every day, especially with kids. If you want to be stupid, smoke pot, because that's what it does to you.
Have you lost your mind? Marijuana, you're making statements that science has already proven
Barry, you have no credibility. You're a former law enforcement agent that is now teaching people how to break the law.
Your approval rating in the United States, the DEA's approval rating, is horrible. You have no credibility.
I'm a former DEA agent.
While this dog and pony show continues on the national stage, it is used to justify the most hideous, self-destructive, violent, and confrontational behavior to enforce these laws. In 2006, the Cato Institute publishes a report called Overkill, The Rise of Paramilitary Police Raids in America. Proponents of the police state behavior have no more arguments. The destruction is widespread, ongoing, ineffective, and often fatal. The victims of this abuse transcend all boundaries and borders within this country, and no one is immune. Perhaps it is unfortunate that this is not a new trend in terms of generational awareness. Anyone who is less than 30 has grown up in America knowing nothing else, and some too, like myself some time ago, elevate and promote this warrior culture. It was not until I read this report that I felt compelled to begin a self-education campaign, because facing the reality of today is where to begin changing it. Radley Belko, funded by the Marijuana Policy Project, examines the trend that began in the 1980s, for no other reason than the war on drugs or these policies implemented on people everywhere. That is, until the war on terror. Rather than receiving funding from localities in which they operate, law enforcement agencies have gotten tremendous assistance from the criminal imperial government. The Pentagon, to justify future purchases, donates surplus military equipment to be used against anyone, at the discretion of local law enforcement. But rather than using discretion, a military culture is inserted. Police are no longer just police. They are giving rise to a new culture of localized government. The zero-tolerance policy expressed by so many, for so long, has created a new warrior class in America. Except that this warrior class brings its war to the streets of the good old USA. In reality, this trend has nothing to do with protecting anyone from drugs, but rather to acclimate the American culture to a new totalitarian, authoritarian way of life. This is the way our global rulers intend to maintain their power and influence. As a result, the police have become one of the biggest threats faced by average Americans. Murders committed by law enforcement are far from isolated incidents. According to statistics in law enforcement agencies across the nation, these extreme measures are not even all that effective. If in Denver in 1999, only 49 of 146 no-knock raids produced criminal charges of any kind, and only 2 convictions, then only 34% of their efforts yielded any drug reduction, and only 1% were successful at putting anyone away for criminal charges. This hardly justifies any increase in the prevalence of these raids. But as with any failure of a government program, throwing more money at the problem is the only solution for policymakers, and so the trends continue to rise. The devastating consequences inherent in these procedures should be clear before their execution, but it is not until the death of an 11-year-old boy in a botched paramilitary raid that the public begins to become aware of the trend in policing. Far from being tolerant and reasonable with citizens who defend themselves against these obviously violent and confrontational practices, courts reprimand anyone who is caught defending themselves against the armed, masked intruders. This is true even when the home's occupants are unaware of a police presence. On the other side of the self-defense issue, the blue wall of silence goes up when most of these operations go wrong. No matter the circumstances or the occupant's guilt or innocence, when police wrongly murder a citizen, the result is typically a paid vacation. The onrush of more and more raids takes its toll on the tranquility of the public. When it was finally realized that these military tactics are making trouble for people, a hotline is established to counsel victims of police violence. They may or may not have expected the volume of calls received immediately following the establishment of it. One citizen gives an accurate macroscopic analysis of the situation. "They can do as they damn well please," he says. "They have a helicopter, a tank, they have carte blanche." Though arming police to be prepared for any situation seems like a no-brainer, when you couple it with military tactics to force entry into the homes of non-violent suspects, which happen to be the majority of the time, you might expect the officers to exercise the utmost restraint, but that is not indicated in this trend. Excessive force at the hands of law enforcement is an understatement. Alarmed, citizens in the home being raided have no recourse but to fight or flee. When the home is entered by armed, masked men who are screaming at the top of their lungs, waking you from a slumber at 3 in the morning, you might well find yourself vacating your body prematurely, as is the case of the Martinez murder. What has become routine procedure has not apparently increased the invader's sense of morality. Why wouldn't anyone want to sit bare naked on your own floor while intruders put a bag over your head and rummage through your belongings? Indeed, these policing trends are making history. America is under threat of terror, and it is coming from within. In 1997, a SWAT team from Dinuba, California, which hadn't reported a single homicide in its history, shot and killed 64-year-old farm worker Ramon Gallardo. This is not a historical precedent that we should be setting up for our future. And as mentioned earlier, not even top local political class is immune from these intrusions. Raids have been conducted on former mayors, cops, judges, lawyers, military members, both active and inactive. And with the burgeoning war on terror, our rulers find yet more reasons to intrude on our daily lives. Radley Balco has since published another report, Rise of the Warrior Cop. Alarming as this behavior should be, let me remind you that the majority of these raids are carried out under the suspicion of drug activity, primarily marijuana. And as we have clearly set out, the use of cannabis is a good thing, and it benefits most everyone who uses it. So the military invasion of the United States has been conducted on premises that are nothing more than farcical. The public record available to everyone demonstrates beyond a reasonable doubt that cannabis is good for us, and yet despite this, we continue to spend billions of dollars each year promoting this sort of behavior among the enforcer class of our society. And as true authoritarians, when that enforcement class makes mistakes or even goes beyond the bounds of reason in their execution of law, we smile, pat them on the back, and give them paid leave for a while. Of course, the cannabis argument really should be inconsequential to the precedent set by these raids, but it exists as one more lie to justify the granting of more authority to one class of our society's members who, rather than earning real authority, have a political race to steal it. And since, in most cases, were you to inquire whether a judge, cop, district attorney has earned some authority on the matter by reading papers like those presented in this documentary, your most likely response would be no. Most people have absolutely no idea what cannabis truly is, and that fact is to our detriment. And cannabis is really only one minuscule subject which we perceive one way because society has delivered us this perception, when in fact the reality is entirely different. But so goes the perceptions of those who fail to investigate on their own the claims of authorities. We are all under this spell, but knowledge is power. But for those of us who continue to support, elevate and uplift the old stance that I grew up with, zero tolerance, I would encourage you to change your tune. But it is far too late to ask you to be careful what you wish for. You already have it.
Police! Search warrant! Search warrant! Search warrant! Get on the ground! Get on the ground! Who's in this house? What's going on? Columbia Police search warrant! Columbia Police search warrant! Columbia Police search warrant! Search warrant! Search warrant! Don't move! Okay. Stand by!
Don't move!
Don't move!
Coming up! Don't move! Police search warrant! Don't move! Search warrant! Search warrant! Don't move! Search warrant! Don't move! Don't move!
Search warrant! Columbia Police search warrant! Don't move! Don't move! Let me see your hands! Don't move!
Don't move! Don't move! Don't move! Get down!
As a monthly pledger for the Marijuana Policy Project, I receive updates on legal proceedings around the country. Their latest update letter states that with your help, marijuana will be legal, taxed and regulated like alcohol, in 16 states by 2017. Though this appears as a hopeful step in the right direction, the situation is already entirely unacceptable, and Americans should have never become acclimated to the presence of such violent, hostile government interventions. But unlike alcohol prohibition, which was a prohibition against a known toxic substance with obvious social consequences, which lasted for only a short 13 years, we have endured this war for almost 80. The current status of active tyranny in the United States is absolute evil. NORMAL, the Marijuana Policy Project, and the many other organizations tasked with correcting laws have not been ineffective for no reason. As I continue to participate in activism on behalf of cannabis, I wonder how, with the copious amounts of information already available to us for generations, we have not already toppled any trace of prohibitory policy on behalf of the government against pot. How is this even possible? I suppose the women persecuted for witchcraft wondered the very same thing, as the fires were lit under their feet. A good portion of the men we credit for the establishment of this nation, America, were already knowledgeable about the tremendous benefits of cannabis. What is more, is that they literally told us to grow it, and this was for good reason. Our founding fathers would never have approved of or even tolerated the behavior that Americans have become accustomed to. In their time, the role of government was far less intrusive than it is today. But the raiding of homes over a prohibition based on known lies is criminal. There is no other appropriate viewpoint, and any moderated version is not reflective of reality. But this statement is best reflected by Barry Goldwater, who said, "I would remind you that extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice. And let me remind you also that moderation in pursuit of justice is no virtue." But Arthur Schopenhauer gave us a bleak version of how truth tends to be accepted by the masses. He said that all truth passes through 3 phases. First, it is ridiculed. Second, it is violently opposed. And last, it is accepted as self-evident. I like to think that we're in the second phase of our re-acceptance of the truth about cannabis. But I've been wrong before, and I'll be wrong again, until I stop breathing. But here's my evidence. Where's yours?